Part 1 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 1. The Reverend Thomas Hunter, executed for the murder of his pupils. The case of this criminal, who was executed in the year 1700 for the barbarous murder of his two pupils, the children of a gentleman named Gordon, an eminent merchant and a bailey or alderman of the city of Edinburgh, is the first on our record, and certainly for its atrocity deserves to be placed at the head of the list of offences which follows its melancholy recital. From the title of the offender it will be seen that he was a preacher of the word of God, and that a person in his situation in life should suffer so ignominious an end for such a crime is indeed extraordinary. But how much more horrible is the fact, which is related to us, that, on the scaffold, when all hope of life and of repentance was past, he expressed his disbelief in that God whom it was his profession to uphold, and whose omnipotence it had been his duty to teach. The malefactor, it would appear, was born of most respectable parents, his father being a rich farmer in the county of Fife, and at an early age he was sent to the University of St. Andrews for his education. His success in the pursuit of classical knowledge soon enabled him to take the degree of Master of Arts, and his subsequent study of divinity was attended with as favourable results. Upon his quitting college, in accordance with the practice of the time, he entered the service of Mr. Gordon in the capacity of chaplain, in which situation it became his duty to instruct the sons of his employer, children, respectively, of the ages of 8 and 10 years. The family consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Gordon, the two boys, their sister, a girl younger than themselves, Mr. Hunter, a young woman who attended upon Mrs. Gordon, and the usual menial servants. The attention of Hunter was attracted by the comeliness of the lady's maid, and a connection of a criminal nature was soon commenced between them. The accidental discovery of this intrigue by the three children was the ultimate cause of the deliberate murder of two of them by their tutor. The young woman and Hunter had retired to the apartment of the latter, but having omitted to fasten the door, the children entered and saw enough to excite surprise in their young minds. In their conversation subsequently at mealtime, they said so much as convinced their parents of what had taken place, and the servant girl was instantly dismissed, while the chaplain, who had always been considered to be a person of mild and amiable disposition and of great genius, was permitted to remain, upon his making such amends to the family as were in his power, by apologizing for his indiscretion. From this moment, however, an inveterate hatred for the children arose in his breast, and he determined to satisfy his revenge upon them by murdering them all. Chance for some time marred his plans, but he was at length enabled to put them into execution as regarded the two boys. It appears that he was in the habit of taking them to walk in the fields before dinner, and the girl on such occasions usually accompanied them, but at the time at which the murder of her brothers was perpetrated she was prevented from going with them. They were at the country seat of Mr. Gordon, situated at a short distance only from Edinburgh, and an invitation having been received for the whole family to dine in that city, Mrs. Gordon desired that all the children might accompany her and her husband. The latter, however, opposed the execution of this plan, and the little girl only was permitted to go with her parents. The intention of the murderer to destroy all the children was by this means frustrated, but he still persevered in his bloody purpose with regard to the sons of his benefactor, whom he determined to murder while they were yet in his power. Proceeding with them in their customary walks, they all sat down together to rest, but the boys soon quitted their tutor to catch butterflies and to gather wild flowers which grew in abundance around them. Their murderer was at that moment engaged in preparing the weapon for their slaughter, and presently calling them to him, he reprimanded them for disclosing to their parents the particulars of the scene which they had witnessed, and declared his intention to put them to death. Terrified by this threat, they ran from him, but he pursued and overtook them, and then throwing one of them on the ground, and placing his knee on his chest, he soon dispatched his brother by cutting his throat with a penknife. This first victim disposed of, he speedily completed his fell purpose with regard to the child whose person he had already secured. The deed, it will be observed, was perpetrated in open day, and it would have been remarkable indeed if, within half a mile of the chief city of Scotland, there had been no human eye to see so horrible an act. A gentleman who was walking on the Castle Hill had a tolerable view of what had passed, and immediately ran to the spot where the deceased children were lying, giving the alarm as he went along, in order that the murderer might be secured. The latter, having accomplished his object, proceeded towards the river to drown himself, but was prevented from fulfilling his intention, and having been seized, he was soon placed in safe custody, intelligence of the frightful event being meanwhile conveyed to the parents of the unhappy children. The prisoner was within a few days brought to trial, under the old Scottish law, by which it was provided that a murderer, being found with the blood of his victim on his clothes, should be prosecuted in the sheriff's court and executed within 3 days. The frightful nature of the case rendered it scarcely uncharitable to pursue a law so vigorous according to its letter, and a jury having been accordingly impanelled, the prisoner was brought to trial and pleaded guilty, adding the horrible announcement of his regret that Miss Gordon had escaped from his revenge. The sentence of death was passed upon the culprit by the sheriff, but it was directed to be carried into effect with the additional terms that the prisoner should first have his right hand struck off, that he should be then drawn up to the gibbet erected near the locality of the murder by a rope, and after that execution he should be hanged in chains between Edinburgh and Leith, the weapon of destruction being passed through his hand, which should be advanced over his head and fixed to the top of the gibbet. The sentence, barbarous as it may now appear, was carried into full execution on the 22nd of August 1700, and frightful to relate, he who in life had professed to be a teacher of the gospel, on his scaffold declared himself to be an atheist. His words were, "There is no God, or if they be, I hold him in defiance." The body of the executed man, having been at first suspended in chains according to the precise terms of his sentence, was subsequently, at the desire of Mr. Gordon, removed to the outskirts of the village of Broughton, near Edinburgh. Alexander Balfour, convicted of murder. The case of this criminal is worthy of some attention, from the very remarkable circumstances by which it was attended. The subject of this sketch was born in 1687, at the seat of his father, Lord Burleigh, near Kinross, and having studied successively at Orwell, near the place of his birth, and at St. Andrews, so successfully as to obtain considerable credit, he returned home, being intended by his father to join the army of the Duke of Marlborough, then in Flanders. Here he became enamoured of Miss Robertson, the governess of his sisters, however, and in order to break off the connection, he was sent to make the tour through France and Italy, the young lady being dismissed from the house of her patron. Balfour, before his quitting Scotland, declared his intention, if ever the young lady should marry, to murder her husband, but deeming this to be merely an empty threat, she was, during his absence, united to a Mr. Syme, with whom she went to live at Inverkeithing. On his return to his father's house, he learned this fact, and immediately proceeded to put his threat into execution. Mrs. Syme, on seeing him, remembering his expressed determination, screamed with affright, but her husband, unconscious of offence, advanced to her aid, and, in the interim, Balfour, entering the room, shot him through the heart. The offender escaped, but was soon afterwards apprehended near Edinburgh, and being tried, was convicted and sentenced to be beheaded by the maiden on account of the nobility of his family. The subsequent escape of the criminal from an ignominious end is not the least remarkable part of his case. The scaffold was actually erected for the purpose of his execution, but on the day before it was to take place his sister went to visit him, and being very like him in face and stature, they changed clothes, and he escaped from prison. His friends having provided horses for him, he proceeded to a distant village, where he lay concealed until an opportunity was eventually offered him of quitting the kingdom. His father died in the reign of Queen Anne, but he had first obtained a pardon for his son, who succeeded to the title and honours of the family, and died in the year 1752, sincerely penitent for his crime. Footnote: different countries have different modes of inflicting capital punishments. Beheading was military punishment among the Romans, known by the name of decollatio. Among them the head was laid on a kippus or block, placed in a pit dug for the purpose, in the army, without the vallum, in the city, without the walls, at a place near the Porta Decumana. Preparatory to the stroke, the criminal was tied to a stake and whipped with rods. In the earlier ages the blow was given with an axe, but in after times with a sword, which was thought the more reputable manner of dying. The execution was but clumsily performed in the first times, but afterwards they grew more expert, and took the head off clean, with one circular stroke. In England beheading is the punishment of nobles, being reputed not to derogate from nobility as hanging does. In France, during the revolutionary government, the practice of beheading by means of an instrument called a guillotine, so denominated from the name of its inventor, was exceedingly general. It resembles a kind of instrument long since used for the same purpose in Scotland, and called a maiden. It is universally known that, at the execution of King Charles I, a man in a visor performed the office of executioner. This circumstance has given rise to a variety of conjectures and accounts, in some of which one William Walker is said to be the executioner, in others it is supposed to be a Richard Brandon, of whom a long account was published in an Exeter newspaper of 1784. But William Lilly, in his History of his Life and Times, has the following remarkable passage: "Many have curiously inquired who it was that cut off his (the King's) head. I have no permission to speak of such things, only this much I say, he that did it is as valiant and resolute a man as lives, and one of a competent fortune." When examined before the Parliament of Charles II, he states that the next Sunday but one after Charles I was beheaded, Robert Spavin, secretary to the Lieutenant General Cromwell at that time, invited himself to dine with me, and brought Anthony Pearson and several others along with him to dinner. That their principal discourse all dinner time was only who it was that beheaded the King. One said it was the common hangman, another Hugh Peters. Others also were nominated, but none concluded. Robert Spavin, so soon as dinner was done, took me by the hand and carried me to the south window. Saith he, "These are all mistaken. They have not named the man that did the fact. It was Lieutenant Colonel Joyce. I was in the room when he fitted himself for the work, stood behind him when he did it. When done, went in with him again. There is no man knows this but my master," viz. Cromwell, Commissary Ireton, and myself. "Doth not Mr. Rushworth know it?" saith I. "No, he doth not know it," saith Spavin. The same thing Spavin hath often related to me when we were alone. The following description of the maiden by Mr. Pennant may not prove uninteresting. "This machine of death is now destroyed, but I saw one of the same kind in a room under the Parliament House in Edinburgh, where it was introduced by the Regent Morton, who took a model of it as he passed through Halifax, and at length suffered by it himself. It is in the form of a painter's easel, and about 10 feet high. At 4 feet from the bottom is the crossbar on which the felon lays his head, which is kept down by another placed above. In the inner edges of the frame are grooves. In these is placed a sharp axe, with a vast weight of lead, supported at the very summit with a peg. To that peg is fastened a cord, which the executioner cutting, the axe falls, and does the affair effectually, without suffering the unhappy criminal to undergo a repetition of strokes, as has been the case in the common method. I must add that if the sufferer is condemned for stealing a horse or cow, the string is tied to the beast, which, on being whipped, pulls out the peg, and becomes the executioner. Captain John Kidd, surnamed the Wizard of the Seas, and Darby Mullins, hanged for piracy. The first named subject of this memoir was born in Greenock in Scotland, and was bred to the sea, and quitting his native land at an early age, he resided at New York, where he eventually became possessed of a small vessel, with which he traded among the pirates, and obtained a complete knowledge of their haunts. His ruling passion was avarice, although he was not destitute of that courage which became necessary in the profession in which he eventually embarked. His frequent remarks upon the subject of piracy, and the facility with which it might be checked, having attracted the attention of some considerable planters, who had recently suffered from the depredations of the marauders who invested the seas of the West Indies, obtained for him a name which eventually proved of great service to him. The constant and daring interruptions offered to trading ships, encouraged as they were by the inhabitants of North America, who were not loath to profit by the irregularities of the pirates, having attracted the attention of the government, the Earl of Bellamont, an Irish nobleman of distinguished character and abilities, was sent out to take charge of the government of New England and New York, with special instructions upon the subject of these marine depredators. Colonel Livingstone, a gentleman of property and consideration, was consulted upon the subject by the governor, and Kidd, who was then possessed of a sloop of his own, was recommended as a fit person to be employed against the pirates. The suggestion met the approbation of Lord Bellamont, but the unsettled state of public affairs rendered the further intervention of government impossible, and a private company, consisting of the Duke of Shrewsbury, the Lord Chancellor Somers, the Earls of Romney and Oxford, Colonel Livingstone, and other persons of rank, agreed to raise £6,000 to pay the expenses of a voyage, the purpose of which was to be directed to the removal of the existing evil, and it was agreed that the Colonel and Captain Kidd, who was to have charge of the expedition, should receive 1/5 of the profits. A commission was then prepared for Kidd, directing him to seize and take pirates, and to bring them to justice, but the further proceedings of the captain and of his officers were left unprovided for. A vessel was purchased and manned, and she sailed under the name of the Adventure from London for New York, at the end of the year 1695. A French ship was seized as a prize during the voyage, and the vessel subsequently proceeded to the Madeira Islands, to Buena Vista and St. Jago, and thence to Madagascar in search of further spoil. A second prize was subsequently made at Calicut, of a vessel of 150 tons burden, which was sold at Madagascar, and at the termination of a few weeks the Adventure made prize of the Quedar Merchant, a vessel of 400 tons burden, commanded by an Englishman named Wright, and officered by 2 Dutch mates and a French gunner, whose crew consisted of Moors. The captain, having carried this vessel into Madagascar, he burned the Adventure, and then proceeded to divide the lading of the prize with his crew, taking 40 shares for himself. He seems now to have determined to act entirely apart from his owners, and he accordingly sailed in the Quedar Merchant to the West Indies. At Anguilla and St. Thomas's he was refused refreshments, but he eventually succeeded in obtaining supplies at Mona, between Porto Rico and Hispaniola, through the instrumentality of an Englishman named Button. This man, who thus at first affected to be friendly to the pirate, soon showed the extent to which his friendship was to be relied upon. He sold a sloop to Kidd, in which the latter sailed, leaving the Quedar Merchant in his care, but on proceeding to Boston, New England, he found his friend there before him, having disposed of the Quedar Merchant to the Spaniards, and having besides given information of his piratical expedition. He was now immediately seized by order of the Lord Bellamont, before whom he endeavoured to justify his proceedings, by contending that he had taken none but lawful prizes, but his lordship transmitted an account of the whole transaction to England, requiring that a ship might be sent to convey Kidd home, in order that he might be punished. A great clamour arose upon this, and attempts were made to show that the proceedings of the pirate had been connived at by the projectors of the undertaking, and a motion was made in the House of Commons that the letters patent granted to the Earl of Bellamont and others, respecting the goods taken from pirates, were dishonourable to the king, against the law of nations, contrary to the laws and statutes of this realm, an invasion of property, and destructive to commerce. Though a negative was put on this motion, yet the enemies of Lord Somers and the Earl of Oxford continued to charge those noblemen with giving countenance to pirates, and it was even insinuated that the Earl of Bellamont was not less culpable than the actual offenders. Another motion was in consequence made to address his Majesty that Kidd might not be tried till the next session of Parliament, and that the Earl of Bellamont might be directed to send home all examinations and other papers relative to the affair. This was carried, and the king complied with the request which was made. As soon as Kidd arrived in England, he was sent for and examined at the bar of the house, with a view to show the guilt of the parties who had been concerned in sending him on the expedition, but nothing arose to criminate any of those distinguished persons. Kidd, who was in some degree intoxicated, made a contemptible appearance at the bar of the house, and a member, who had been one of the most earnest to have him examined, violently exclaimed, "I thought the fellow had been only a knave, but unfortunately he happens to be a fool likewise." Kidd was at length tried at the Old Bailey, and was convicted on the clearest evidence, but neither at that time nor afterwards did he charge any of his employers with being privy to his infamous proceedings. He was executed with one of his companions at Execution Dock on the 23rd of May 1701. After he had been tied up to the gallows, the rope broke and he fell to the ground, but being immediately tied up again, the ordinary, who had before exhorted him, desired to speak with him once more, and on this second application entreated him to make the most careful use of the few further moments thus providentially allotted to him for the final preparation of his soul to meet its important change. These exhortations appear to have the wished-for effect, and he died, professing his charity to all the world, and his hopes of salvation through the merits of his Redeemer. The companion in crime of this malefactor, and his companion also at the gallows, was named Darby Mullins. He was born in a village in the north of Ireland, about 16 miles from Londonderry, and having resided with his father, and followed the business of husbandry till he was about 18, the old man then died, and the young one went to Dublin, but he had not been long there before he was enticed to go to the West Indies, where he was sold to a planter, with whom he resided 4 years. At the expiration of that term he became his own master, and followed the business of a waterman, in which he saved money enough to purchase a small vessel, in which he traded from one island to another till the time of the earthquake at Jamaica in the year 1691, from the effects of which he was preserved in a miraculous manner. He afterwards went to Kingston, where he kept a punch house, and then proceeding to New York, he married, but at the end of 2 years, his wife dying, he unfortunately fell into company with Kidd, and joined him in his piratical practices. He was apprehended with his commander, and, as we have already stated, suffered the extreme penalty of the law with him. End of Part 1. Part 2 of The Chronicles of Crime by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2. George Cadell, executed for the murder of Miss Price, whom he had seduced. This delinquent was a native of Bromsgrove in Worcestershire, where he was articled to an apothecary. Having served his time, he proceeded to London to complete his studies in surgery, and he then entered the service of Mr. Randall, a surgeon at Worcester, as an assistant. Here he was admired for his extremely amiable character, as well as for the abilities which he possessed, and he married the daughter of his employer, who, however, died in giving birth to her first child. He subsequently resided with Mr. Dean, a surgeon in Lichfield, and during his employment by that gentleman he became enamoured of his daughter, and would have been married to her but for the commission of the crime which cost him his life. It would appear that he had become acquainted with a young woman named Elizabeth Price, who had been seduced by an officer in the army, and who supported herself by her skill in needlework, residing near Mr. Cadell's abode. An intimacy subsisted between them, the result of which was the pregnancy of Miss Price, and she repeatedly urged her paramour to marry her. Mr. Cadell resisted her importunities for a considerable time, until at last Miss Price, hearing of his paying his addresses to Miss Dean, became more importunate than ever, and threatened, in case of his non-compliance with her wishes, to put an end to all his prospects with that young lady by discovering everything that had passed between them. Hereupon Cadell formed the horrid resolution of murdering Miss Price. He accordingly called on her on a Saturday evening, and requested that she would walk in the fields with him on the afternoon of the following day, in order to adjust the plan of their intended marriage. Thus deluded, she met him at the time appointed, on the road leading towards Burton-upon-Trent, at the Nag's Head public house, and accompanied her supposed lover into the fields. They walked about till towards evening, when they sat down under the hedge, and after a little conversation, Cadell suddenly pulled out a knife, cut the wretched woman's throat, and made his escape. In the distraction of his mind, he left behind him the knife with which he had perpetrated the deed, together with his case of instruments. On his returning home it was observed that he appeared exceedingly confused, though the reason of the perturbation of his mind could not be guessed at, but on the following morning, Miss Price being found murdered in the field, great numbers of people went to see the body. Among them was the woman of the house where she lodged, who recollected that she had said she was going to walk with Mr. Cadell, and then the instruments were examined, and were known to have belonged to him. He was in consequence taken into custody, and committed to the jail of Stafford, and being soon afterwards tried, was found guilty, condemned, and executed at Stafford on the 21st of July, 1701. Thomas Cook, executed for murder. The death of this person exhibits the singular fatality which attends some men who have been guilty of crime. Cook was the son of a butcher, who was considered a person of respectability, residing at Gloucester. He was apprenticed to a barber surgeon in London, but running away before his time had expired, he entered the service of one of the pages of honour to William III, but he soon after quitted this situation to set up at Gloucester as a butcher, upon the recommendation of his mother. Restless, however, in every station of life, he repaired to London, where he commenced prize fighter at May Fair, which at this time was a place greatly frequented by prize fighters, thieves, and women of bad character. Here puppet shows were exhibited, and it was the favourite resort of all the profligate and abandoned, until at length the nuisance increased to such a degree that Queen Anne issued her proclamation for the suppression of vice and immorality, with a particular view to this fair, in consequence of which the justices of peace issued their warrant to the High Constable, who summoned all the inferior constables to his assistance. When they came to suppress the fair, Cook, with a mob of about 30 soldiers and other persons, stood in defiance of the peace officers and threw brickbats at them, by which some of them were wounded. Cooper, a constable, being the most active, Cook drew his sword and stabbed him in the belly, and he died of the wound at the expiration of 4 days. Hereupon Cook fled to Ireland, and as it was deposed upon his trial, while he was in a public house, he swore in a profane manner, for which the landlord censured him, and told him there were persons in the house who would take him in custody for it, to which he answered, "Are there any of the informing dogs in Ireland? We in London drive them, for at a fair called Mayfair there was a noise which I went out to see, 6 soldiers and myself. The constables played their parts with their staves, and I played mine, and when the man dropped, I wiped my sword, put it up, and went away." The fellow was subsequently taken into custody and sent to Chester, whence being removed to London, he was tried at the Old Bailey, was convicted, and received sentence of death. After conviction he solemnly denied the crime for which he had been condemned, declaring that he had no sword in his hand on the day the constable was killed, and was not in company with those who killed him. Having received the sacrament on the 21st of July 1703, he was taken from Newgate to be carried to Tyburn, but when he had got to High Holborn, opposite Bloomsbury, a respite arrived for him till the following Friday. On his return to Newgate he was visited by numbers of his acquaintance, who rejoiced on his narrow escape. On Friday he received another respite till the 11th of August, but on that day he was executed. John Peter Dramatti, executed for the murder of his wife. This unfortunate man was the son of Protestant parents, and was born at Saverdun, in the county of Foix, and province of Languedoc, in France. He received a religious education, but when he arrived at years of maturity, he left his own country and went into Germany, where he served as a horse grenadier under the Elector of Brandenburg, who was afterwards King of Prussia. When he had been in this condition about a year, he came over to England, and entered into the service of Lord Havisham, and afterwards enlisted as a soldier in the regiment of Colonel de la Melonière. Having made 2 campaigns in Flanders, the regiment was ordered into Ireland, where it was dismissed from farther service, in consequence of which Dramatti obtained his discharge. He now became acquainted with a widow between 50 and 60 years of age, who pretended that she had a great fortune, and was allied to the royal family of France, and he soon married her, not only on account of her supposed wealth and rank, but also of her understanding English and Irish, thinking it prudent to have a wife who could speak the language of the country in which he proposed to spend the remainder of his life. As soon as he discovered that his wife had no fortune, he went to London and offered his services to Lord Havisham, and was again admitted as one of his domestics. His wife, unhappy on account of their separate residence, wished to live with him at Lord Havisham's, which he would not consent to, saying that his lordship did not know he was married. The wife now began to evince the jealousy of her disposition, and frequent quarrels took place between them, because he was unable to be with her so frequently as she desired. At length, on the 9th of June 1703, Dramatti was sent to London from his master's house at Kensington, and calling upon his wife at her lodgings near Soho Square, she endeavoured to prevail upon him to stay with her. This, however, he refused, and finding that he was going home, she went before him and stationed herself at the park gate. On his coming up, she declared that he should go no further unless she accompanied him, but he quitted her abruptly and went onwards to Chelsea. She pursued him to the Bloody Bridge, and there seized him by the neckcloth and would have strangled him, but that he beat her off with his cane. He then attacked her with his sword, and having wounded her in so many places as to conclude that he had killed her, his passion immediately began to subside, and, falling on his knees, he devoutly implored the pardon of God for the horrid sin of which he had been guilty. He went on to Kensington, where his fellow servants, observing that his clothes were bloody, he said he had been attacked by two men in Hyde Park, who would have robbed him of his clothes, but that he defended himself and broke the head of one of them. The real fact, however, was subsequently discovered, and Dramatti being taken before a magistrate to whom he confessed his crime, the body of his wife was found in a ditch between Hyde Park and Chelsea, and a track of blood was seen to the distance of 20 yards, at the end of which a piece of a sword was found sticking in a bank, which fitted the other part of the sword in the prisoner's possession. The circumstances attending the murder being proved to the satisfaction of the jury, the culprit was found guilty, condemned, and on the 21st of July 1703 was executed at Tyburn. William Elby, executed for murder. This young man was born in the year 1667 at Deptford in Kent, and served his time with a blockmaker at Rotherhithe, during which he became acquainted with some women of ill fame. After the term of his apprenticeship had expired, he kept company with young fellows of such bad character that he found it necessary to enter on board a ship to prevent worse consequences. Having returned from sea, he enlisted as a soldier, but while in this situation he committed many small thefts, in order to support the women with whom he was connected. At length he deserted from the army, assumed a new name, and prevailed on some of his companions to engage in housebreaking. Detection soon terminated his career, and in September 1704 he was indicted for robbing the house of Barry, Esquire, of Fulham, and murdering his gardener. Elby, it seems, having determined on robbing the house, arrived at Fulham soon after midnight, and had wrenched open one of the windows, at which he was getting in, when the gardener, awakening, came down to prevent the intended robbery with a light in his hand. Elby, terrified lest he should be known, seized a knife and stabbed him to the heart, and the poor man immediately fell dead at his feet. This done, he broke open a chest of drawers and stole about £250, with which he repaired to his associates in London. The murder soon became the subject of very general conversation, and Elby being at a public house in the Strand, it was mentioned, and he became so alarmed on seeing one of the company rise and quit the house, that he suddenly ran away without paying his reckoning. The landlord was enraged at his being cheated, and learning his address from one of his companions, he caused him to be apprehended, and he was eventually committed for trial on suspicion of being concerned in the robbery and murder. On his trial, he steadily denied the perpetration of the crimes with which he was charged, and his conviction would have been very doubtful, had not a woman with whom he cohabited became an evidence, and swore that he came from Fulham with the money the morning after the commission of the fact. Some other persons also deposed that they saw him come out of Mr. Barry's house on the morning the murder was committed, and he was found guilty, and having received sentence of death was executed at Fulham on the 13th of September 1704, and was hung in chains near the same place. John Smith, convicted of robbery. Though the crimes committed by this man were not particularly atrocious, nor his life sufficiently remarkable for a place in this work, yet the circumstances attending his fate at the place of execution are perhaps more singular than any we may have to record. He was the son of a farmer at Malton, about 15 miles from the city of York, who bound him apprentice to a packer in London, with whom he served his time, and afterwards worked as a journeyman. He then went to sea on board a man of war, and was at the expedition against Vigo, but on his return from that service he was discharged. He afterwards enlisted as a soldier in the regiment of Guards commanded by Lord Cutts, but in this station he soon made bad connections, and engaged with some of his dissolute companions as a housebreaker. On 5th of December 1705 he was arraigned on 4 different indictments, on 2 of which he was convicted, while he lay under sentence of death, he seemed very little affected with his situation, absolutely depending on a reprieve through the interest of his friends. An order, however, came for his execution on the 24th day of the same month, in consequence of which he was carried to Tyburn, where he performed his devotions and was turned off in the usual manner. But when he had hung near 15 minutes, the people present cried out, "A reprieve!" Hereupon the malefactor was cut down, and being conveyed to a house in the neighbourhood, he soon revived, upon his being bled and other proper remedies applied. When he perfectly recovered his senses, he was asked what were his feelings at the time of execution, to which he repeatedly replied, in substance, as follows: that when he was turned off, he for some time was sensible of very great pain, occasioned by the weight of his body, and felt his spirits in a strange commotion, violently pressing upwards, that, having forced their way to his head, he as it were saw a great blaze or glaring light, which seemed to go out at his eyes with a flash, and then he lost all sense of pain. That after he was cut down and began to come to himself, the blood and spirits forcing themselves into their former channels put him, by a sort of pricking or shooting, to such intolerable pain, that he could have wished those hanged who had cut him down. From this circumstance he was called Half-Hanged Smith. After this narrow escape from the grave, Smith pleaded to his pardon on the 20th of February and was discharged. Yet such was his propensity to evil deeds that he returned to his former practices, and being apprehended was again tried at the Old Bailey for housebreaking, but some difficulties arising in the case, the affair was left to the opinion of the 12 judges, who determined in favour of the prisoner. After this second extraordinary escape, he was a third time indicted, but the prosecutor happening to die before the day of the trial, he once more obtained that liberty which his conduct showed had not deserved. We have no account of what became of this man after this third remarkable incident in his favour, but Christian charity inclines us to hope that he made a proper use of the singular dispensation of Providence evidenced in his own person. It was not infrequently the case that in Dublin men were formerly seen walking about who, it was known, had been sentenced to suffer the extreme penalty of the law, and upon whom, strange as it may appear to unenlightened eyes, the sentence had been carried out. The custom until lately was that the body should hang only half an hour, and, in a mistaken lenity, the sheriff, in whose hands was entrusted the execution of the law, would look away after the prisoner had been turned off, while the friends of the culprit would hold up their companion by the waistband of his breeches, so that the rope should not press upon his throat. They would, at the expiration of the usual time, thrust their deceased friend into a cart, in which they would gallop him over all the stones and rough ground they came near, which was supposed to be a never-failing recipe in order to revive him, professedly, and indeed in reality, with the intention of waking him. An anecdote is related of a fellow named Mahoney, who had been convicted of the murder of a Connaught man, in one of the numerous Munster and Connaught wars, and whose execution had been managed in the manner above described, who, being put into the cart in a coffin by his Munster friends, on his way home was so revived, and so overjoyed at finding himself still alive, that he sat upright and gave 3 hearty cheers, by way of assuring his friends of his safety. A gentleman, who was shocked at this indecent conduct in his defunct companion, and who was, besides, afraid of their scheme being discovered and thwarted, immediately, with the sapling which he carried, hit him a thump on the head, which effectually silenced his self-congratulations. On their arrival at home, they found that the friendly warning which had been given to the poor wretch had been more effectual than the hangman's rope, and the wailings and lamentations which had been employed at the place of execution to drown the encouraging cries of the aiders of the criminal's escape were called forth in reality at his wake on the same night. It was afterwards a matter of doubt whether the fellow who dealt the unfortunate blow ought not to have been charged with the murder of his half-hanged companion, but, a justice being consulted, it was thought no one could be successfully charged with the murder of a man who was already dead in law. End of Part 2. Part 3 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, Part 3. William Gregg, executed for high treason. The treason of which this offender was convicted was that of adhering to the Queen's enemies and giving them aid without the realm, which was made a capital offence by the statute of Edward III. It appears that Gregg was a native of Montrose in Scotland, and, having received such instruction as the grammar schools of the place afforded, he completed his education at Aberdeen University, where he pursued these studies which were calculated to fit him for the profession of the Church, for which he was intended. London, however, held forth so many attractions to his youthful eye that the wishes of his relatives were soon overruled, and having visited that city with good introductions, he was, after some time, appointed secretary to the ambassador at the court of Sweden. But while performing the duties of his office, he was guilty of so many and so great excesses that he was at length compelled to retire, and London once more became his residence. His good fortune placed him in a situation alike honourable and profitable, but his dishonest and traitorous conduct in his employment was such as to cost him his life, and to involve his employers in political difficulties of no ordinary kind. Having been engaged by Mr. Secretary Harley, Minister of the reigning sovereign, Queen Anne, to write dispatches, he took advantage of the knowledge which he thus gained, and voluntarily opened a communication with the enemies of his country. England, it will be remembered, was at this time in a situation of no ordinary difficulty, and the position of Her Majesty's ministers, harassed as they were by the opposition of their political antagonists, was rendered even more difficult by the disclosures of their traitorous servant. We shall take the advantage afforded us by Bishop Burnet's history, of laying before our readers a more authentic account of this transaction than is given by the usual channels of information to which we have access. He says, "At this time 2 discoveries were made very unlucky for Mr. Harley. Tallard wrote often to Chamillard, but he sent the letters open to the Secretary's office to be perused and sealed up, and so be conveyed by way of Holland. These were opened upon some suspicion in Holland, and it appeared that one in the Secretary's office put letters in them, in which, as he offered his services to the courts of France and Saint-Germain, so he gave an account of all transactions here. In one of these he sent a copy of the letter that the Queen was to write in her own hand to the Emperor, and he marked what parts were drawn by the Secretary, and what additions were made to it by the Lord Treasurer. This was the letter by which the Queen pressed the sending Prince Eugene into Spain, and this, if not intercepted, would have been at Versailles many days before it could reach Vienna. He who sent this wrote that by this they might see what service he could do them, if well encouraged. All this was sent over to the Duke of Marlborough, and upon search it was found to be written by one Gregg, a clerk whom Harley had not only entertained but had taken into a particular confidence, without inquiring into the former parts of his life, for he was a vicious and necessitous person, who had been secretary to the Queen's envoy in Denmark, but was dismissed by him for his ill qualities. Harley had made use of him to get him intelligence, and he came to trust him with the perusal and sealing up of the letters, which the French prisoners here in England sent over to France, and by that means he got into the method of sending intelligence thither. He, when seized on, either upon remorse or hopes of pardon, confessed all, and signed his confession. Upon that he was tried, and, pleading guilty, was condemned as a traitor for corresponding with the Queen's enemies. At the same time, Valliere and Barra, whom Harley had employed as his spies to go often over to Calais, under the pretence of bringing him intelligence, were informed against as spies employed by France to get intelligence from England, who carried over many letters to Calais and Boulogne, and, as was believed, gave such information of our trade and convoys, that by their means we had made our great losses at sea. They were often complained of upon suspicion, but they were always protected by Harley. Yet the presumptions against them were so violent that they were at last seized on and brought up prisoners. The Whigs took such advantage of this circumstance that Mr. Harley was obliged to resign, and his enemies were inclined to carry matters still farther, and were resolved, if possible, to find out evidence enough to affect his life. With this view, the House of Lords ordered a committee to examine Gregg and other prisoners, who were very assiduous in the discharge of their commission, as will appear by the following account, written by the same author. The lords who were appointed to examine Gregg could not find out much by him. He had but newly begun his designs of betraying secrets, and he had no associates with him in it. He told them that all the papers of state lay so carelessly about the office that every one belonging to it, even the doorkeepers, might have read them all. Harley's custom was to come to the office late on post nights, and after he had given his orders and wrote his letters, he usually went away and left all to be copied out when he was gone. By that means he came to see everything, in particular the Queen's letter to the Emperor. He said he knew the design on Toulon in May last, but he did not discover it, for he had not entered on his ill practices till October. This was all he could say. By the examination of Valliere and Barra, and many others who lived about Dover and were employed by them, a discovery was made of a constant intercourse they were in with Calais under Harley's protection. They often went over with boats full of wool, and brought back brandy, though both the import and export were severely prohibited. They and those who belonged to the boats carried over by them were well treated on the French side at the governor's house, or at the commissaries. They were kept there until their letters were sent to Paris, and till returns could be brought back, and were all the while upon free cost. The order that was constantly given them was, that if an English or Dutch ship came up with them, they should cast their letters into the sea, but that they should not do it when French ships came up with them. So they were looked on by all on that coast as the spies of France. They used to get what information they could, both of the merchant ships and of the ships of war that lay in the Downs, and upon that they usually went over, and it happened that soon after some of those ships were taken. These men, as they were papists, so they behaved themselves insolently, and boasted much of their power and credit. Complaints had often been made of them, but they were always protected, nor did it appear that they ever brought any information of importance to Harley but once, when, according to what they swore, they told him that Fourbaum was gone from Dunkirk to lie in wait for the Russian fleet, which proved to be true. He both went to watch for them, and he took the greater part of the fleet. Yet, though this was a single piece of intelligence that they ever brought, Harley took so little notice of it that he gave no advertisement to the Admiralty concerning it. This particular excepted, they only brought over common news and the Paris Gazetteer. These examinations lasted for some weeks. When they were ended, a full report was made of them to the House of Lords, and they ordered the whole report with all the examinations to be laid before the Queen. Upon the conviction of Gregg, both Houses of Parliament petitioned the Queen that he might be executed, and on the 28th of April 1708 he was accordingly hanged at Tyburn. While on the scaffold he delivered a paper to the sheriffs of London and Middlesex, in which he acknowledged the justice of his sentence, declared his sincere repentance of all his sins, particularly that lately committed against the Queen, whose forgiveness he devoutly implored. He also expressed his wish to make all possible reparation for the injuries he had done, and testified the perfect innocence of Mr. Secretary Harley, whom he declared to have been no party to his proceedings. He professed that he died a member of the Protestant Church, and declared that the want of money to supply his extravagancies had tempted him to commit the fatal crime, which cost him his life. It is a remarkable circumstance in the life of this offender, that while he was corresponding with the enemy, and taking measures to subvert the government, he had no predilection in favour of the Pretender. On the contrary, he declared, while he was under sentence of death, that he never thought he had any right to the throne of these realms. Richard Thornhill, Esquire, convicted of manslaughter in killing Sir C. Deering in a duel. This was a case which arose out of the practice of duelling, which has always existed almost peculiarly among the higher classes of society. Mr. Thornhill and Sir Cholmondeley Deering, having dined together on the 7th of April 1711, in company with several other gentlemen, at the Toy at Hampton Court, a quarrel arose, during which Sir Cholmondeley struck Mr. Thornhill. A scuffle ensuing, the wainscot of the room broke down, and Thornhill, falling, the other stamped on him and beat out some of his teeth. The company now interposed, and Sir Cholmondeley, convinced that he had acted improperly, declared that he was willing to ask pardon. But Mr. Thornhill said that, asking pardon was not a proper retaliation for the injury that he had received, adding, "Sir Cholmondeley, you know where to find me." Soon after this the company broke up, and the parties went home in different coaches, without any farther steps being taken towards their reconciliation. On the next day the following letter was written by Mr. Thornhill. April the 8th, 1711. Sir, I shall be able to go abroad to-morrow morning, and desire you will give me a meeting with your sword and pistols, which I insist on. The worthy gentleman who brings you this will concert you with the time and place. I think Tothill Fields will do well. Hyde Park will not at this time of year, being full of company. I am your humble servant, Richard Thornhill. On the 9th of April, Sir Cholmondeley went to the lodgings of Mr. Thornhill, and the servant showed him to the dining room. He ascended with a brace of pistols in his hand, and soon afterwards Mr. Thornhill, coming to him, asked him if he would drink tea, but he declined. A hackney coach was then sent for, and the gentlemen rode to Tothill Fields, where, unattended by seconds, they proceeded to fight their duel. They fired their pistols almost at the same moment, and Sir Cholmondeley, being mortally wounded, fell to the ground. Mr. Thornhill, after lamenting the unhappy catastrophe, was going away, when a person stopped him, and told him he had been guilty of murder, and took him before a justice of the peace, who committed him to prison. On the 18th of May Mr. Thornhill was indicted at the Old Bailey Sessions for the murder, and the facts already detailed having been proved, the accused called several witnesses to show how ill he had been used by Sir Cholmondeley, that he had languished some time of the wounds he had received, during which he could take no other sustenance than liquids, and that his life was in imminent danger. Several persons of distinction swore that Mr. Thornhill was of a peaceable disposition, and that, on the contrary, the deceased was of a remarkable quarrelsome temper, and it was also deposed that Sir Cholmondeley, being asked if he came by his hurt through unfair usage, replied, "No, poor Thornhill, I am sorry for him. This misfortune was my own fault, and of my own seeking. I heartily forgive him, and desire you all to take notice of it, that it may be of some service to him, and that one misfortune may not occasion another." The jury acquitted Mr. Thornhill of the murder, but found him guilty of manslaughter, in consequence of which he was burnt in the hand. Colonel John Hamilton, convicted of manslaughter as second in a duel. There was no occurrence which at the time occupied so much of the public attention and excited so much general interest as the duel which took place in the year 1711 between the Duke of Hamilton and Lord Mohun, in which unhappily both the principals fell. The gentleman who is the subject of the present notice was the second of the noble Duke, and appears to have been connected with him by the ties of relationship. At the sessions held at the Old Bailey on the 11th of September, he was indicted for the murder of Charles Lord Mohun, Baron of Oakhampton, on the 15th of November preceding, and at the same time he was indicted for abetting Charles Lord Mohun and George Macartney, Esquire, in the murder of James, Duke of Hamilton and Brandon. Colonel Hamilton pleaded not guilty, and evidence was then adduced, which showed that Lord Mohun, having met the Duke of Hamilton at the chambers of a master in Chancery on Thursday the 13th of November, a misunderstanding arose between them respecting the testimony of a witness. On the return home of his lordship, he directed that no person should be admitted to him except Mr. Macartney, and subsequently he went with that gentleman to a tavern. The Duke of Hamilton and his second, Colonel Hamilton, were also in the tavern, and from thence they all proceeded to Hyde Park. The only evidence which exhibited the real circumstances immediately attending the duel was that of William Morris, a groom, who deposed that, as he was walking his horses towards Hyde Park, he followed a hackney coach with two gentlemen in it, whom he saw alight by the lodge and walk together towards the left part of the ring. They were there about a quarter of an hour when he saw two other gentlemen come to them, and, having saluted each other, one of them, who he was since told was the Duke of Hamilton, threw off his cloak, and one of the other two, who he now understands was Lord Mohun, his surtout coat, and all immediately drew. The Duke and Lord pushed at each other but a very little while, when the Duke closed, and took the Lord by the collar, who fell down and groaned, and the Duke fell upon him. That just as Lord Mohun was dropping, he saw him lay hold of the Duke's sword, but could not tell whether the sword was at that time in his body, nor did he see any wound given after the closing, and was sure that Lord Mohun did not shorten his sword. He declared he did not see the seconds fight, but they had their swords in their hands, assisting their lords. It further appeared that the bodies of the deceased noblemen were examined by Messrs. Boussier and Amy, surgeons, and that in that of the Duke a wound was found between the second and third ribs on the right side, and also that there were wounds in his right arm, which had cut the artery and one of the small tendons, as well as others in his right and left leg. There was also a wound in his left side between his second and third ribs, which ran down into his body and pierced the midriff and caul, but it appeared that the immediate cause of the sudden death of his Grace was the wound in his arm. It was further proved, as regarded the body of Lord Mohun, that there was a wound between the short ribs, quite through his belly, and another about 3 inches deep in the upper part of his thigh, a large wound about 4 inches wide in his groin, a little higher, which was the cause of his immediate death, and another small wound on his left side, and that the fingers of his left hand were cut. The defence made by the prisoner was that the Duke called him to go abroad with him, but he knew not anything of the matter till he came into the field. Some Scottish noblemen and other gentlemen of rank gave Mr. Hamilton a very excellent character, asserting that he was brave, honest, and inoffensive, and the jury, having considered of the affair, gave a verdict of manslaughter, in consequence of which the prisoner prayed the benefit of the statute which was allowed him. At the time the lives of these noblemen were thus unfortunately sacrificed, many persons thought they fell by the hands of the seconds, and some writers on the subject subsequently affected to be of the same opinion, but nothing appears in the written or printed accounts of the transaction, nor did anything arise on the trial to warrant so ungenerous a suspicion. It is therefore but justice to the memory of all the parties to discredit such insinuations. William Lowther and Richard Keel, executed for the murder of Edward Perry, a turnkey, of Clerkenwell Bridewell. William Lowther was a native of Cumberland, and being bound to the master of a Newcastle ship which traded to London, he became acquainted with low abandoned company in the metropolis. Richard Keel was a native of Hampshire, and served his time to a barber at Winchester, and on coming to London he married and settled in his own business in Rotherhithe, but not living happily with his wife, he parted from her, cohabited with another woman, and associated with a number of disorderly people. On the 10th of December 1713 they were indicted at the Old Bailey for assisting Charles Horton in the murder of Edward Perry. The case was as follows. The prisoners, together with 2 other desperate offenders of the name of Horton and Cullum, having been convicted of felony at the Old Bailey, were sentenced to be kept to hard labour in Clerkenwell Bridewell for 2 years. On their being carried thither, Mr. Boreman, the keeper, thought it necessary to put them in irons to prevent their escape. This they all refused to submit to, and Boreman having ordered the irons, they broke into the room where the arms were deposited, seized what they thought fit, and then attacked the keeper and his assistants, and cruelly beat them. Lowther bit off a part of a man's nose. At this time Perry, one of the turnkeys, was without the gate, and desired the prisoners to be peaceable, but, advancing towards them, he was stabbed by Horton, and during the fray Horton was shot dead. The prisoners being at length victorious, many of them made their escape, but the neighbours giving their assistance, Keel and Lowther and several others were taken and convicted on the clearest evidence. Some time after conviction, a smith went to the prison to take measure of them for chains in which they were to be hung, pursuant to an order from the Secretary of State's office, but they for some time resisted him in his duty. On the morning of execution, the 13th of December 1713, they were carried from Newgate to Clerkenwell Green, and there hanged on a gallows, after which their bodies were put in a cart drawn by 4 horses, decorated with plumes of black feathers, and hung in chains. End of Part 3. Part 4 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 4. William Johnson and Jane Housden, executed for the murder of Spurling, a turnkey in the Old Bailey. It is not a little remarkable that 2 instances should have occurred within so short a space of time as 9 months, in which the officers of the Crown should have fallen victims to the exertions which they were compelled to make in the discharge of their duties. The male prisoner in this case, William Johnson, was a native of Northamptonshire, where he served his time to a butcher, and, removing to London, he opened a shop at Newport Market, but business not succeeding to his expectation, he pursued a variety of speculations, until at length he sailed to Gibraltar, where he was appointed a mate to one of the surgeons of the garrison. Having saved some money at this place, he came back to his native country, where he soon spent it, and then had recourse to the highway for a supply. Being apprehended in consequence of one of his robberies, he was convicted, but received a pardon. Previously to this he had been acquainted with Jane Housden, his fellow in crime, who had been tried and convicted of coining, but had obtained a pardon, but who in September 1714 was again in custody for a similar offence. On the day that she was to be tried, and just as she was brought down to the bar of the Old Bailey, Johnson called to see her, but Mr. Spurling, the head turnkey, telling him that he could not speak to her till her trial was ended, he instantly drew a pistol, and shot Spurling dead on the spot, in the presence of the court and all the persons attending to hear the trials, Mrs. Housden at the same time encouraging him in the perpetration of this singular murder. The event had no sooner happened than the judges, thinking it unnecessary to proceed on the trial of the woman for coining, ordered both the parties to be tried for the murder, and there being many witnesses to the deed, they were convicted and received sentence of death. From this time to that of their execution, which took place September 19, 1714, and even at the place of their death, they behaved as if they were wholly insensible of the enormity of the crime which they had committed, and, notwithstanding the publicity of their offence, they had the confidence to deny it to the last moment of their lives, nor did they show any signs of compunction for their former sins. After hanging the usual time, Johnson was hung in chains near Holloway, between Islington and Highgate. The Earl of Derwentwater, Lord Kenmure, the Earl of Winton, and others, executed for treason. The circumstances attending the crime of these individuals, intimately connected as they were with the history of the royal family of England, must be too well known to require them to be minutely repeated. On the accession of George I. to the throne of Great Britain, the question of the right of succession of King James III., as he was termed, which had long been secretly agitated, began to be referred to more openly, and his friends, finding themselves in considerable force in Scotland, sent an invitation to him in France, where he had taken refuge, to join them, for the purpose of making a demonstration, and of endeavouring to assume by force that which was denied him as of right. The noblemen, whose names appear at the head of this article, were not the least active in their endeavours to support the title of the Pretender, by enlisting men under his standard, and their proceedings, although conducted with all secrecy, were soon made known to the government. The necessary steps were immediately taken for quelling the anticipated rebellion, and many persons were apprehended on suspicion of secretly aiding the rebels, and were committed to jail. Meanwhile the Earl of Mar, the chief supporter of the Pretender, was in open rebellion at the head of an army of 3,000 men, which was rapidly increasing, marching from town to town in Scotland, proclaiming the Pretender as King of England and Scotland by the title of James III. An attempt was made by stratagem to surprise the castle of Edinburgh, and with this object some of the king's soldiers were base enough to receive a bribe to admit those of the Earl of Mar, who were, by means of ladders or rope, to scale the walls and surprise the guard, but the Lord Justice Clerk, having some suspicion of the treachery, seized the guilty, and many of them were executed. The rebels were greatly chagrined at this failure of their attempt, and the French king, Louis XIV., from whom they hoped for assistance, dying about this time, the leaders became disheartened, and contemplated the abandonment of their project until their king could appear in person among them. They were aided, however, by the discontent which showed itself in another quarter. In Northumberland the spirit of rebellion was fomented by Thomas Forster, then one of the members of Parliament for that county, who, being joined by several noblemen and gentlemen, attempted to seize the large and commercial town of Newcastle, but was driven back by the friends of the government. Forster now set up the standard of the Pretender, and proclaimed him the lawful king of Great Britain and Scotland wherever he went, and eventually joining the Scotch rebels he marched with them to Preston in Lancashire. They were there attacked by Generals Carpenter and Wills, who succeeded in routing them and in making 1,500 persons prisoners, among whom were the Earl of Derwentwater and Lord Widrington, English peers, and the Earls of Nithisdale, Winton and Carnworth, Viscount Kenmore and Lord Nairn, Scottish peers. These noblemen, with about 300 more rebels, were conveyed to London, while the remainder taken at the Battle of Preston were sent to Liverpool and its adjacent towns. At Highgate, the party intended for trial in London was met by a strong detachment of foot guards, who tied them back to back, and placed 2 on each horse, and in this ignominious manner were they held up to the derision of the populace, the lords being conveyed to the Tower, and the others to Newgate and other prisons. The Earl of Mar, on the day of the battle, attempted to cross the Forth, but was prevented by a squadron of the British fleet, which had anchored off Edinburgh, and Sir John Mackenzie, on the part of the Pretender, having fortified the town of Inverness. Lord Lovat, at this time an adherent of the reigning monarch, but subsequently a friend to the cause of the Stuarts, for aiding whose rebellion in 1745 he was beheaded, armed his tenants, and drove him from his fortifications. The Pretender subsequently managed to elude the vigilance of the British ships appointed to prevent his landing, and crossing the Channel in a small French vessel, disembarked in Scotland with only 6 followers, but having obtained the assistance of a few half-armed Highlanders, on the 9th of January 1716 he made a public entry into the Palace of Scone, the ancient place of coronation for the Scottish kings. He there assumed the functions of a king, and so much of the powers of royalty as he was able to secure, and issued a proclamation for his coronation. The Duke of Argyle at this time, with his army in winter quarters at Stirling, however, determined to attack the rebel forces, and, advancing upon them, they fled at his approach. The Pretender, having been encouraged to rebel by France, was in anticipation of receiving succour at the hands of the French king, and in the hope of some aid reaching him, he proceeded to Dundee, and thence to Montrose, where, soon rendered hopeless by receiving no news of the approach of the foreigners, he dismissed his adherents. The king's troops pursued and put several to death, but the Pretender, accompanied by the Earl of Mar and some of the leaders of the rebellion, had the good fortune to get on board a ship lying before Montrose, and, in a dark night, put to sea, escaped the English fleet, and landed in France. The unfortunate noblemen who had been secured were meanwhile committed to the custody of the Keeper of the Tower, and the House of Commons unanimously agreed to impeach them and expel Forster from his seat as one of their members, while the courts of common law proceeded with the trials of those of less note. The articles of impeachment being sent by the Commons, the Lords sat in judgment, Earl Cowper, the Lord Chancellor of England, being constituted Lord High Steward. All the peers who were charged, except the Earl of Winton, pleaded guilty to the indictment, but offered pleas of extenuation for their guilt, in hopes of obtaining mercy. In that of the Earl of Derwentwater, he suggested that the proceedings in the House of Commons, in impeaching him, were illegal. Proclamation was then made, and the Lord High Steward proceeded to pass sentence upon James Earl of Derwentwater, William Lord Widrington, William Earl of Nithisdale, Robert Earl of Carnworth, William Viscount Kenmure, and William Lord Nairn. His lordship having detailed the circumstances attending their impeachment, and having answered the argumentative matter contained in their pleas, and urged in extenuation of their offences, proceeded to say, "It is my duty to exhort your lordships to think of the aggravations as well as the mitigations, if there be any, of your offences, and if I could have the least hopes that the prejudices of habit and education would not be too strong for the most earnest and charitable entreaties, I would beg you not to rely any longer on those directors of your consciences by whose conduct you have, very probably, been led into this miserable condition, in allusion to their lordships being members of the Roman Catholic Church, but that your lordships would be assisted by some of those pious and learned divines of the Church of England who have constantly borne that infallible mark of sincere Christians, universal charity. And now, my lords, nothing remains but that I pronounce upon you, and sorry I am that it falls to my lot to do it, that terrible sentence of the law, which must be the same that is usually given against the meanest offender of the like kind. The most ignominious and painful parts of it are usually remitted, by the grace of the Crown, to persons of your quality; but the law, in this case, being deaf to all distinctions of persons, requires I should pronounce, and accordingly it is adjudged by this court, that you, James Earl of Derwentwater, William Lord Widdrington, William Earl of Nithisdale, Robert Earl of Carnwath, William Viscount Kenmure, and William Lord Nairn, and every of you, return to the prison of the Tower from whence you came. From thence you must be drawn to the place of execution. When you come there, you must be hanged by the neck, but not till you be dead, for you must be cut down alive. Then your bowels must be taken out and burnt before your faces. Then your heads must be severed from your bodies, and your bodies divided each into 4 quarters, and these must be at the king's disposal. And God Almighty be merciful to your souls. After sentence thus passed, the lords were remanded to the Tower, and on the 18th of February orders were sent to the Lieutenant of the Tower and the sheriffs for their execution. Great solicitations were made in favour of them, which not only reached the court but the 2 Houses of Parliament, and petitions were delivered in both, which, being supported, occasioned debates. That in the House of Commons went no farther than to occasion a motion for adjournment, so as to prevent any farther interposition there. But the matter in the House of Peers was carried on with more success, where petitions were delivered and spoke to, and it was carried by 9 or 10 voices that they should be received and read. The question was also put whether the king had power to reprieve in case of impeachment, and this being carried in the affirmative, a motion was made to address his Majesty to desire him to grant a reprieve to the lords under sentence, but the movers only obtained this clause, viz., to reprieve such of the condemned lords as deserved his mercy, and that the time of the respite should be left to his Majesty's discretion. The address having been presented, his Majesty replied, that on this and other occasions he would do what he thought most consistent with the dignity of his crown and the safety of his people. The great parties which had been made by the rebel lords, as was said, by means of money, and the rash expressions too common in the mouths of many of their friends, as if the government did not dare to execute them, did not a little contribute to hasten their execution. For on the same day that the address was presented, the 23rd of February, it was resolved in council that the Earl of Derwentwater and the Lord Kenmure should be beheaded on the next day, and the Earl of Nithisdale, apprehending he should be included in the warrant, succeeded in making his escape on the evening before, in a woman's riding hood, supposed to have been conveyed to him by his mother on a visit. On the morning of the 24th of February, 3 detachments of the Life Guards went from Whitehall to Tower Hill, and, having taken their stations round the scaffold, the 2 lords were brought from the Tower at 10 o'clock, and being received by the sheriffs at the bar, were conducted to the Transport Office on Tower Hill. At the expiration of about an hour, the Earl of Derwentwater sent word that he was ready, on which Sir John Fryer, one of the sheriffs, walked before him to the scaffold, and, when there, told him he might have what time he pleased to prepare himself for death. His lordship desired to read a paper which he had written, the substance of which was, that he was sorry for having pleaded guilty, that he acknowledged no king but James III, for whom he had an inviolable affection, that the kingdom would never be happy until the ancient constitution was restored, and he wished that his death might contribute to that end. His lordship professed to die in the Roman Catholic faith, and said at the end of his speech, which he delivered, that if that prince who then governed had given him life, he should have thought himself obliged never more to take up arms against him. He then read some prayers, and kneeled to see how the block would fit him, and having told the executioner that he forgave him, as well as all his enemies, he desired him to strike when he should repeat the words, "Sweet Jesus," for the 3rd time. He immediately proceeded to prepare himself for the blow of the axe, and having placed his neck so that it might be fairly struck, he said, "Sweet Jesus, receive my spirit. Sweet Jesus, be merciful unto me. Sweet Jesus, and was proceeding in his prayer when his head was severed from his body at one blow. The executioner then took it up, and carrying it to the four corners of the scaffold, said, "Behold the head of a traitor! God save King George!" The body was directly wrapped in black baize, and being carried to a coach was delivered to the friends of the deceased, and the scaffold having been cleared, fresh baize was put on the block, and new sawdust strewed, so that no blood should appear. Lord Kenmure was then conducted to the place of execution. His lordship was a Protestant, and was attended by 2 clergymen. He declined saying much to them, however, telling one of them that he had prudential reasons for not delivering his sentiments, which were supposed to arise from his regard to Lord Carnwath, who was his brother-in-law, and who was then interceding for the royal mercy. Lord Kenmure, having finished his devotions, declared that he forgave the executioner, to whom he made a present of 8 guineas. He was attended by a surgeon, who drew his finger over that part of the neck where the blow was to be struck, and being executed as Lord Derwentwater had been, his body was delivered to the care of an undertaker. George, Earl of Winton, not having pleaded guilty with the other lords, was brought to his trial on the 15th of March, when the principal matter urged in his favour was that he had surrendered at Preston in consequence of a promise from General Wills to grant him his life, in answer to which it was sworn that no promise of mercy was made, but that the rebels surrendered at discretion. The circumstances of the Earl of Winton having left his house with 14 or 15 of his servants well mounted and armed, his joining Earl Carnwath and Lord Kenmure, his proceeding with the rebels through the various stages of their march, and his surrendering with the rest, were fully proved, notwithstanding which his counsel moved in arrest of judgment, but the plea on which this motion was founded being thought insufficient, his peers unanimously found him guilty. The Lord High Steward then pronounced sentence on him, after having addressed him in forcible terms in the same manner as he had sentenced the other peers. The Earls of Winton and Nithisdale afterwards found means to escape out of the Tower, and Messrs Forster and Mackintosh escaped from Newgate, but it was supposed that motives of mercy and tenderness in the Prince of Wales, afterwards George II, favoured the flight of all these gentlemen. This rebellion occasioned the untimely death of many other persons. 5 were executed at Manchester, 6 at Wigan, and 11 at Preston, but a considerable number was brought to London, and being arraigned in the Court of Exchequer, most of them pleaded guilty and suffered the utmost rigour of the law. James Sheppard, executed for high treason. This is a very singular case of treason, for though the crime for which Sheppard suffered was committed 3 years after the rebellion was quelled, yet the same misjudged opinions urged this youth to enthusiasm in the cause of the Pretender as those which actuated the former offenders. It is still more singular that he, being neither a Scotchman born nor in any way interested in the mischiefs which he contemplated, should, unsolicited, volunteer in so dangerous a cause. James Sheppard was the son of Thomas Sheppard, Glover, in Southwark, but his father dying when he was about 5 years of age, he was sent to school in Hertfordshire, where his uncle, Dr. Hinchcliffe, removed him to Salisbury, where he remained at school 3 years. Being at Salisbury at the time of the rebellion, he imbibed the principles from his schoolfellows, many of whom were favourers of the Pretender, and he was confirmed in his sentiments by reading some pamphlets which were then put into his hands. When he quitted Salisbury, Dr. Hinchcliffe put him an apprentice to Mr. Scott, a coach painter in Devonshire Street, Bishopsgate, and he continued in this situation about 14 months, when he was apprehended for the crime which cost him his life. Sheppard, having conceived the idea that it would be a praiseworthy action to kill the king, wrote a letter which he intended for a non-juring minister of the name of Leake, but, mistaking the spelling, he directed it to the Reverend Mr. Heath. The letter was in the following terms: "Sir, from the many discontents visible throughout this kingdom, I infer that if the prince now reigning should be by death removed, our king being here, he might be settled on his throne without much loss of blood. For the more ready effecting of this, I propose that, if any gentleman will pay for my passage into Italy, and if our friends will entrust one so young with letters of invitation to his majesty, I will, on his arrival, smite the usurper in his palace. In this confusion, if sufficient forces may be raised, his majesty may appear. If not, he may retreat or conceal himself till a fitter opportunity. Neither is it presumptuous to hope that this may succeed, if we consider how easy it is to cut the thread of human life, how great the confusion the death of a prince occasions in the most peaceful nation, and how mutinous the people are, how desirous of a change. But we will suppose the worst, that I am seized, and by torture examined. Now, that this may endanger none but myself, it will be necessary that the gentlemen who defray my charges to Italy leave England before my departure, that I be ignorant of his Majesty's abode, that I lodge with some Whig, that you abscond, and that this be communicated to no one. But, be the event as it will, I can expect nothing less than a most cruel death, which, that I may the better support, it will be requisite that, from my arrival till the attempt, I every day receive the Holy Sacrament from one who shall be ignorant of the design. James Shepherd. Having carried it to Mr. Leake's house, he called again for an answer, but he was apprehended, and carried before Sir John Fryer, a magistrate. When he was brought to his trial, he behaved in the most firm and composed manner, and after the evidence was given and the jury had found him guilty of high treason, he was asked why sentence should not be passed on him according to the law, when he said, he could not hope for mercy from a prince whom he would not own. The recorder then proceeded to pass sentence on him, in pursuance of which he was executed at Tyburn on the 17th of March 1718. He was attended by a non-juring clergyman up to the time of his execution, between whom and the ordinary the most indecent disputes arose, extending even up to the time of his arriving at the scaffold, when the latter quitted the field and left the other to instruct and pray with the malefactor as he might think proper. End of part 4.